Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're popping the hood and looking straight into the hidden gears of international trade law. We are going to unpack a truly fascinating World Trade Organization appellate body report, and honestly, it beautifully illustrates how global trade rules actually work in practice. It's this wild journey that connects seemingly completely unrelated industries through the rigorous, almost mathematical logic of legal precedent. So, right off the bat, what does the dispute over Korean beef have to do with India's solar panels? I know, it sounds kind of like the setup to a weird joke, right? But I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you are going to see exactly how a historical argument over agricultural imports ended up dictating the rules for modern renewable energy tech. It is literally a perfect example of how the past shapes the future in international law. Here's our precedent pathway for today. We've got 1. The solar trade dispute, 2. Decoding government procurement, 3. The short supply defense, 4. The Korea beef precedent, and 5. The final WTO ruling. Let's jump right in. Part 1. The solar trade dispute. Let's look at the core conflict between the United States and India. Okay, so let's set the stage. The arena for this high-stakes dispute is the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Think of them as the global referee. When member nations have disagreements about whether their domestic laws are breaking international trade agreements, they bring them here. And in this specific case, the dispute centers on a massive, highly ambitious renewable energy initiative in India called the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission. Under this mission, India rolled out something called DCR measures. That stands for Domestic Content Requirements. These measures essentially laid down a rule. If solar developers wanted to sell their electricity to the government, they absolutely had to use solar cells and modules that were manufactured right there in India. And that brings us to the core clash. The U.S. stepped in and said, hey, this unfairly discriminates against foreign-made equipment, which violates international trade rules designed to keep the playing field level. But India pushed back. They argued their policies were perfectly justified under some very specific pre-existing exemptions found within the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Specifically, India pointed to exemptions regarding government procurement and situations of short supply. So our job today is to objectively examine exactly how the WTO evaluated these two very different arguments. Moving right along to Section 2, Decoding Government Procurement. Let's look at India's first major legal hurdle. So there's this rule, GATT Article 3.8a, which provides an exception for government procurement. India argued that because their government was purchasing electricity from these solar-powered developers, the domestic requirements on the solar panels should be totally exempt from standard trade rules. Sounds plausible, right? Well, when evaluating this, the WTO drew a really strict line. The appellate body report stated that this exemption does not apply when a member purchases one product, like electricity, but then discriminates against another completely different product, like the solar cells used to actually make that electricity. This brings us to what the WTO calls the competitive relationship standard. For this government loophole to work, the product being bought and the product being discriminated against have to be in a competitive relationship. They need to be identical or at least directly substitutable. But India bought electricity and discriminated against solar cells. And, well, electricity and solar panels just aren't interchangeable, are they? You can't plug your TV into a solar cell. This strict rule exists for a reason. It stops countries from using government procurement as a sneaky backdoor to hide unfair trade barriers. With that first defense out, we move to Section 3, the short supply defense. India didn't give up. They invoked another specific exemption. GATT Article XXJ allows for measures that are essential to the acquisition or distribution of products in general or local short supply. Basically, India argued, look, we literally don't have enough domestic manufacturing capacity for solar components yet, so these products are in local short supply. They were arguing that they needed to force domestic manufacturing just to fix this local shortage. And this sparked a really fascinating debate over the definition of just one word, local. India took a super narrow view. They said local supply means you only look at your own domestic factories to see if there's a shortage. But the WTO, they totally disagreed. They ruled that when determining if a product is in short supply in a local market, you absolutely cannot just look at what's made inside the country. You have to consider the international supply that is available to be imported. Because foreign solar cells were readily available on the global market to be brought into India, there was no true short supply to justify breaking the rules. All right, now we arrive at Section 4, the absolute climax of our explainer, the Korea beef precedent. Remember that weird question I asked at the beginning? Well, here is where the beef comes in. International trade law relies heavily on past rulings. When the WTO was evaluating another one of India's defenses about securing compliance with their own domestic laws, the WTO didn't just invent a new standard out of thin air. They pulled a tool directly from a much older, very famous dispute known as Korea Various Measures on Beef. Back in the day, Korea had implemented strict import measures that essentially forced imported foreign beef to be sold in completely separate retail stores from domestic beef. To solve that specific agricultural dispute, the WTO created a brand new legal test. That Korea beef dispute was an absolute game changer because it firmly established what the WTO calls the necessity test. Whenever a country tries to justify a trade restriction by saying it's necessary to secure compliance with its laws, the WTO applies this exact test. It looks at whether a measure is truly indispensable, and crucially, it demands that we look to see if there are other, less trade-restrictive alternatives that could achieve the exact same goal. The WTO took this test, forged in a battle over beef import measures, and applied it step by step to India's modern solar panel requirements. Honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the hidden engine of global trade. The legal framework adopted way back on January 10, 2001, to resolve a dispute about importing chilled beef is the exact same legal lens applied 15 years later to assess cutting-edge solar policies. The physical products literally couldn't be more different, but their legal DNA, it's identical. Let's move to our final section, the final WTO ruling. Let's see how all of this came together. So here is how the final scorecard actually shook out. India's procurement defense failed because electricity and solar cells just aren't the same product. Their short supply defense failed because foreign panels were easily available globally. And their compliance defense failed because it simply couldn't pass that strict necessity test forged by the Korea beef precedent. The conclusive outcome of the appellate body report was crystal clear. The WTO upheld that India's domestic content requirements under the National Solar Mission violated international trade agreements. It's a really stark reminder. While domestic policies aiming to boost local manufacturing are super common, they still have to operate strictly within the bounds of agreed-upon international law and the impartial precedents that govern it. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. We've just seen exactly how a ruling from 2001 about imported beef laid the groundwork for resolving a modern conflict over renewable energy infrastructure. The gears of precedent, they never stop turning. So if beef shaped solar energy, what seemingly unrelated industry will today's solar dispute shape tomorrow? What crazy future technologies are going to be governed by the legal logic established in this very report? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.